What you're about to hear will completely change how you see the people around you. Because sometimes the most extraordinary minds are hiding in the most unexpected places. And this is the story of how a 49-year-old Silicon Valley CEO learned the hardest lesson of her life from the woman she thought was just there to empty her trash cans. Sarah Williams had built Technova Solutions from nothing into a $200 million powerhouse in just 8 years. And she wore her success like armor. Her designer suits perfectly pressed, her corner office overlooking the San Francisco Bay, serving as a daily reminder that she had conquered a world where women like her weren't supposed to win. Every morning at exactly 7:30 a.m., she would stride through those glass doors in her Louboutin heels, her blonde hair pulled back in the kind of severe bun that said, "Don't even think about wasting my time." And the entire office would feel the shift in energy that came with the arrival of someone who had never learned the word impossible. But what Sarah Williams was about to discover would shatter every assumption she'd ever made about intelligence, worth, and the invisible people who keep our world running. Because while she was busy being brilliant in her ivory tower, there was someone else in that building who was brilliant in ways Sarah couldn't even imagine. Estefany Morales arrived at Technova every evening at 6 p.m. when the executives were long gone and the fluorescent lights hummed their lonely song over empty cubicles. Her small frame barely visible in the navy blue uniform that marked her as part of the cleaning crew. And if you had walked past her pushing that cart full of supplies, you would have seen exactly what Sarah Williams saw every day. Nothing worth noticing. She was 45 years old, her dark hair streaked with premature gray, her hands rough from years of work, her accent thick enough that most people stopped listening before she finished her sentences. And she moved through those offices like a ghost, invisible and silent, the way people like her are trained to be. For 3 years, Estefany had cleaned Sarah's office every single night, wiping down the massive mahogany desk where billion-dollar decisions were made, emptying the trash can that held the crumpled dreams of failed startups, polishing the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a city where fortunes were won and lost before breakfast. And not once, not even once, had Sarah Williams looked up from her phone long enough to learn her name. That was about to change in the most spectacular way possible. The crisis had been building for weeks, and by Tuesday morning in March, Sarah was facing the kind of disaster that ends careers and bankrupts companies. Because Beijing International Ventures, the most powerful investment firm in China, was ready to inject $15 million into Technova's revolutionary AI platform. But there was a problem that no amount of money or connections could solve. The technical documentation, all 847 pages of highly specialized artificial intelligence protocols, was written in Mandarin Chinese, and not the simplified kind that college students learn, but the complex technical language that takes decades to master. Sarah had burned through her entire network trying to find someone qualified to translate these documents, and every expert she contacted was either booked solid for months or demanding fees that would eat into the profit margin so deeply it would make the entire deal pointless. The meeting with Liu Wei, the legendary venture capitalist who had the power to transform Technova from a successful startup into a global empire, was scheduled for Friday afternoon. And Sarah had exactly 72 hours to understand every technical detail in those documents, or watch 15 million disappear into the California fog. She had been in her office since 4 a.m. that Tuesday morning, her third cup of coffee growing cold as she stared at the incomprehensible characters covering her multiple monitors. And for the first time in her career, Sarah Williams felt the crushing weight of true helplessness. She had conquered coding languages that would make most programmers weep. She had memorized financial models that would impress Harvard Business School professors. She had negotiated with venture capitalists who ate startups for breakfast and picked their teeth with the bones. But those elegant symbols dancing across her screen might as well have been written in an alien language from another galaxy. The irony was devastating. Sarah's entire company was built on breaking down communication barriers through artificial intelligence, but she couldn't crack the code of the one language that stood between her and the biggest deal of her life. And as she sat there surrounded by the empire she had built, she realized that all her success meant nothing if she couldn't solve this one impossible problem. That's when everything started to fall apart even faster. Marcus Chen, her head of operations and the closest thing she had to a friend in the corporate world, knocked on her door at 9:47 a.m. with the expression of someone delivering news that would require industrial-strength alcohol to process. 3 more translation services had just called to decline her project, 2 because they claimed the technical specifications were too advanced for their teams, and 1 because they said the timeline was physically impossible for human comprehension. The best offer she had received so far was from Dr. Jennifer Liu at Stanford, who wanted $75,000 up front and 6 weeks minimum, which would push the meeting with Beijing International Ventures into late April. And by then, Sarah knew the Chinese firm would have moved on to the 17 other AI startups that were desperately competing for their attention. But Marcus had more bad news brewing, because at 11:23 a.m., Sarah's assistant Rebecca burst through her door with tears in her eyes and a phone in her trembling hand, explaining that their backup translator, the one who had promised to review the documents over the weekend, had just suffered a heart attack and was in intensive care at UCSF Medical Center. The secondary backup, a brilliant linguist from UC Berkeley who specialized in technical Mandarin, had just texted to say his mother was dying and he was flying to Taiwan on the next available flight. Sarah felt the walls of her empire starting to crumble around her, and she did something she hadn't done since she was 12 years old. She put her head in her hands and fought back tears that tasted like failure and broken dreams. The afternoon brought even worse news, because at 2:15 p.m., Liu Wei's assistant called from Beijing to confirm the Friday meeting and casually mentioned that they had received very promising proposals from Teknova's 3 biggest competitors, including Quantum Dynamics, the company that Sarah had been battling for market dominance for the past 2 years. The assistant's voice was professionally polite, but Sarah could hear the underlying message. Beijing International Ventures had options, and Teknova was rapidly becoming the least attractive one. By 4 p.m., Sarah had made the kind of desperate calls that successful CEOs aren't supposed to make, reaching out to her ex-husband's brother who taught Mandarin at a community college. He laughed and hung up. A college roommate who had married a Chinese businessman. She was in Shanghai and couldn't help. And even her former boss who had connections in the translation industry. He was in rehab and couldn't take calls. She was drowning in her own success, surrounded by people who admired her from a distance but couldn't throw her the lifeline she desperately needed. That's when Sarah made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Because at 4:47 p.m., she sent an email to the entire Teknova staff, offering a $10,000 bonus to anyone who could help with urgent Mandarin translation services. And she marked it as highest priority, with the kind of desperation that employees could smell through their computer screens. The responses started flooding in within minutes, and they ranged from useless to insulting. Jerry from accounting knew a guy who had studied abroad in Beijing for a semester. Lisa from marketing had the Google Translate app on her phone. David from IT suggested they hire his nephew, who was majoring in Asian studies at San Jose State University. And 12 different employees helpfully provided links to online translation services that Sarah had already tried and been rejected by. But then, at 5:23 p.m., when Sarah was seriously considering whether it was possible to learn Mandarin Chinese in 3 days through some kind of advanced hypnosis technique, something happened that changed everything. Because Rebecca knocked on her door and said the words that would either save Sarah's empire or destroy it forever. There's someone here who says she can help with the Chinese documents, but you're not going to like who it is. Sarah looked up from her computer screen, her eyes bloodshot from 14 hours of staring at incomprehensible symbols, her perfectly styled hair now a disaster zone of stress and caffeine, and asked the question that would alter the trajectory of both their lives. At this point, Rebecca, I don't care if it's my grandmother's ghost speaking through a Ouija board. Just send them in. What walked through that door at 5:24 p.m. was not what Sarah Williams expected, because Stephanie Morales stood there in her cleaning uniform. Her small hands clutched around a worn manila folder, her dark eyes filled with the kind of nervous determination that comes from knowing you're about to either save the day or make a complete fool of yourself. And when she spoke, Her accent was thick enough that Sarah had to lean forward to understand her words. "Mrs. Williams, I heard about your problem with the Chinese papers, and I think maybe I can help you." Sarah's first instinct was to laugh, not because she was cruel, but because the situation was so absurd it felt like the universe was playing some kind of cosmic practical joke on her. And she could imagine the headline in TechCrunch: Silicon Valley CEO loses $15 million deal because she relied on her cleaning lady for translation services. But something in Estephanie's posture, the way she held that folder like it contained state secrets, made Sarah pause long enough to ask the question that politeness demanded. "Estefanie, right? That's very sweet of you to offer. But this is extremely technical documentation that requires years of specialized training to understand. I already looked at the first few pages when I was emptying your trash yesterday, and I recognize the terminology from artificial intelligence neural network protocols, specifically the documentation standards used by Beijing University's computer science department." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes earthquakes, because Sarah Williams had just heard her cleaning lady casually mention Beijing University's computer science department like she was discussing the weather. And suddenly the fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the air too thin, and everything Sarah thought she knew about the world felt like it was shifting on its axis. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper when she asked, "Estefanie, how exactly do you know about Beijing University's documentation standards?" And the answer that came back would be the first crack in a dam that was about to burst and flood Sarah's carefully constructed worldview, with the kind of truth that successful people spend their entire careers trying to avoid. Estefanie opened that manila folder with hands that were no longer shaking and pulled out a document that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat, because it was a page of the Chinese technical specifications, covered in handwritten notes in perfect English. And the translation was so precise, so technically accurate, that Sarah could immediately understand concepts that had been completely incomprehensible just moments before. "I studied computational linguistics at Beijing University for 6 years," Estefanie said quietly, her accent somehow seeming less thick now, as if removing this secret had also removed some invisible barrier. "I specialized in artificial intelligence language processing, with a focus on neural network documentation standards. I wrote my master's thesis on cross-cultural technical communication in AI development protocols." Sarah stared at those handwritten notes, her brain trying to process information that didn't fit into any of the categories she used to organize her world. Because this woman, this invisible woman who had been emptying her trash cans for 3 years, had just casually mentioned having a master's degree from one of China's most prestigious universities, and Sarah realized she was looking at the solution to her impossible problem, except the solution was wearing a cleaning uniform and speaking with the accent of someone Sarah had unconsciously dismissed as unimportant. The questions started pouring out before Sarah could stop them. "Why are you working as a cleaner? Why didn't you tell anyone about your background? How long have you been listening to our conversations about AI development?" And with each question, Sarah felt more and more like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole into a world where nothing was what it seemed. Estefanie's answer was simple and devastating, because nobody asks the cleaning lady about her education, Mrs. Williams. They see the uniform and they stop seeing the person. "I needed work 3 years ago, and this job pays enough to send money to my family in Guadalajara and still have something left over. I kept quiet because I learned a long time ago that when people like you find out that people like me have education, they get uncomfortable, like the world isn't working the way it's supposed to." Sarah felt something cold and sharp twist in her stomach, because she realized that for 3 years, while she had been struggling with complex AI protocols and paying consultants thousands of dollars to explain concepts that Estefanie probably understood better than anyone else in the building, the solution had been pushing a mop cart past her door every single evening, invisible and ignored. But there wasn't time for guilt or introspection, because the clock on Sarah's wall showed 5:34 p.m. on Tuesday, and she had exactly 71 hours and 26 minutes to prepare for the most important meeting of her career. So she did what successful people do when they find themselves in impossible situations. She made a decision that was either brilliant or insane. "Stephanie?" Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fact that her world was tilting sideways. "If you can translate these 847 pages of technical documentation by Friday morning, and if your translation is accurate enough to help me understand every single detail of Beijing International Ventures AI protocol requirements, I will pay you $50,000 cash, and I will personally ensure that you never have to push another mop cart for the rest of your life." The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning two completely different worlds. And Sarah watched as Stephanie's expression shifted through surprise, calculation, and something that might have been hope, before settling into the kind of determined focus that Sarah recognized from her own mirror during the early days of building Technova. "Mrs. Williams," Stephanie said, her voice stronger now, "I can have the complete translation ready by Thursday evening, with detailed analysis of every technical specification, cross-referenced with current AI industry standards, and formatted for executive presentation. But I want to ask you something first, or will you go back to not seeing me?" But before Sarah could formulate an answer that wouldn't sound like corporate propaganda, Stephanie was already walking toward the door, that manila folder tucked under her arm like a weapon she was preparing to use to change both their lives forever. "I'll start tonight," Stephanie said, pausing in the doorway. "I'll work through the documentation in the small conference room on the 3rd floor, the one nobody uses after hours. I'll have progress reports ready every 12 hours so you can track the work and verify the accuracy as we go." That night, Sarah stayed late at the office for the first time in months, not because she had work to do, but because she needed to see for herself whether this was real, or whether the stress of the past few weeks had finally pushed her into some kind of corporate breakdown where she was hallucinating solutions from impossible sources. At 9:47 p.m., she walked down to the 3rd floor and peered through the glass door of Conference Room C, and what she saw there made her question everything she thought she knew about intelligence, education, and the invisible hierarchies that govern our professional lives. Stephanie had transformed the small conference room into what looked like a war room run by someone who understood both the technical complexity of artificial intelligence development and the cultural nuances of Chinese business communication. The whiteboard was covered with diagrams that mapped out the logical flow of the AI protocols. Chinese characters were paired with English translations that showed not just literal meaning, but contextual significance. And spread across the table were reference books that Sarah recognized as some of the most advanced texts on machine learning and neural network architecture. But what stopped Sarah cold was seeing Stephanie herself, no longer in her cleaning uniform, but wearing jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in the kind of efficient ponytail that Sarah associated with serious academics, and her entire demeanor had shifted from invisible service worker to focused professional, who was clearly in her element. As Stephanie looked up from the documents she was analyzing and saw Sarah standing in the doorway, and instead of the nervous deference Sarah was used to, she saw something that looked remarkably like confidence mixed with a hint of challenge, as if Stephanie was daring Sarah to continue underestimating her. "The first section is more complex than I initially thought," Stephanie said, her accent still present, but somehow seeming less prominent now that she was speaking about technical concepts instead of cleaning schedules. "Beijing International Ventures isn't just looking for a standard AI integration. They're proposing a hybrid neural network that combines Western machine learning protocols with Chinese algorithmic approaches that I haven't seen implemented in commercial applications before." "What kind of hybrid approach?" Sarah asked. And she was surprised to realize that she was asking the question the same way she would ask Marcus or her head of development, without the unconscious condescension she usually used when talking to service staff. Stephanie pointed to a section of the Chinese text that was covered with her handwritten notes, and Sarah could see that the translation was annotated with references to academic papers, industry standards, and technical specifications that demonstrated a depth of knowledge Sarah hadn't encountered outside of doctoral programs at top-tier universities. They're proposing to integrate Baidu's deep learning architecture with Google's TensorFlow protocols, but modified to process Mandarin semantic structures while maintaining compatibility with English language data inputs. Stephanie explained. And Sarah realized she was listening to someone who didn't just understand the technical documentation, but who understood the strategic implications of what Beijing International Ventures was actually proposing. Sarah paused, trying to process the implications of what she was hearing. That's not just a $15 million investment. If they can make that hybrid architecture work commercially, they're positioning themselves to dominate AI markets in both Western and Chinese economies simultaneously. Exactly, Stephanie said. This isn't just venture capital investment. This is Beijing International Ventures offering to make Teknova the bridge between two AI ecosystems that have been developing separately for the past decade. The question is whether your current infrastructure can handle the computational requirements they're describing in sections 23 through 31. Sarah felt her pulse quicken because she had been so focused on the impossibility of translating the documents that she hadn't considered the possibility that the documents might reveal an opportunity that was exponentially larger than anything she had imagined. And she was starting to understand that Stephanie hadn't just solved her translation problem. She might have uncovered the key to transforming Teknova from a successful startup into a global technology powerhouse. But then Sarah looked at her watch and realized it was 10:23 p.m. and she was standing in a conference room discussing advanced AI architecture with her former cleaning lady. And the absurdity of the situation crashed over her like a wave, followed immediately by a much more uncomfortable realization. If Stephanie was this qualified, this knowledgeable, this capable of understanding complex technical concepts that challenged even Sarah's expertise, then what did that say about Sarah's ability to recognize talent, evaluate people, and build the kind of team that could actually execute on the opportunities she was discovering? Stephanie, Sarah said, her voice careful and measured, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. How long have you been listening to our technical discussions during your cleaning rounds? And what else do you know about Teknova's development projects that you haven't told me? Stephanie set down her pen and looked directly at Sarah with the kind of steady gaze that Sarah was used to giving other people, not receiving from them. And when she spoke, her words carried the weight of someone who had been watching, listening, and understanding far more than anyone had bothered to notice. Mrs. Williams, Stephanie said, I've been in every meeting room in this building. I've heard every conversation about technical challenges, market strategies, and competitive analysis. I've seen the whiteboards after your brainstorming sessions. I've read the documents you throw away when you think they're not good enough. And I've watched you and your team struggle with problems that I solved in my head months ago. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face because she was starting to understand that for 3 years, Teknova had been under observation by someone with the technical expertise to evaluate their strategies, identify their weaknesses, and probably anticipate their next moves, and that someone had been invisible, ignored, and completely underestimated by the very people she was analyzing. The quantum encryption project you abandoned last year, Stephanie continued, her voice gaining strength. You gave up because you couldn't figure out how to make it scalable for commercial applications. The solution is in the Beijing University research I published in 2018, but it was written in Mandarin, so your research team never found it. Sarah's legs felt unsteady, and she had to grip the back of a conference room chair to maintain her balance, because Stephanie had just casually mentioned publishing research that could have saved Teknova months of development time and hundreds of thousands of dollars in abandoned project costs. And Sarah realized she was looking at someone who hadn't just been watching her company from the outside, but who had been quietly evaluating their technical capabilities and finding them wanting. The partnership with Microsoft that fell through 6 months ago, Stephanie continued, seemingly unaware of the impact her words were having on Sarah's worldview. It failed because you couldn't demonstrate cross-platform compatibility with Asian language processing systems. I could have solved that integration challenge in 2 weeks, but nobody asked the cleaning lady for her opinion on software architecture. But Stephanie wasn't finished because she pulled out another folder from her bag. This one thick with what looked like detailed technical documentation. And when she opened it, Sarah saw diagrams and code samples that looked more advanced than anything her highly paid development team had produced in the past year. I've been working on solutions to Teknova's technical challenges in my spare time, Stephanie said, her voice now carrying the confidence of someone who was no longer pretending to be invisible. "I have prototype designs for improved neural network efficiency, detailed plans for the quantum encryption scalability problem, and a complete framework for the Chinese language processing integration that Microsoft wanted." Sarah stared at those documents, her mind racing through the implications of what she was seeing. Because if even half of what Stephanie was claiming was accurate, then Sarah had been sitting on top of intellectual property and technical innovations that could revolutionize Teknova's market position. And she had been completely oblivious to their existence because she had never thought to look beyond the surface of who she assumed people to be. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before? Why did you let me struggle with these problems when you had the solutions?" They said my education credentials from Beijing University weren't equivalent to American degrees, and they suggested I might be more suitable for support services positions. The words hit Sarah like physical blows because she was starting to understand that the crisis she was facing with Beijing International Ventures wasn't just about translation or communication barriers. It was about the systematic ways that successful people like herself had been trained to overlook talent that didn't come packaged in familiar credentials, accents, and appearances. "I took the cleaning job because I needed income, while I figured out how to get American certifications that would make my Chinese education acceptable to companies like yours," Stephanie continued. "But after a few months of listening to your technical discussions and seeing the challenges your team was facing, I realized that the problems weren't with my qualifications or my knowledge. The problems were with assumptions about who is qualified to contribute to innovation." "Stephanie," Sarah said, her voice shaking with something that might have been anger or shame or recognition. "If you finish translating these documents by Thursday, if you help me understand what Beijing International Ventures is really proposing, and if your technical analysis is as accurate as what I've seen tonight, I'm not just going to pay you $50,000. Sarah paused, looking around the conference room that had been transformed into a workspace that demonstrated more technical sophistication than her official development labs, and made a decision that would either save her company or destroy her career. "I'm going to offer you the position you should have been hired for 3 years ago. Chief Technology Officer, with equity, salary, and the authority to implement every solution you've been developing, while I was too blind to see who was actually the most qualified person in this building." Stephanie looked at Sarah for a long moment, and Sarah could see her calculating not just the professional opportunity, but the personal cost of trusting someone who had spent 3 years proving that she couldn't see past surface appearances to recognize actual qualifications and capabilities. "Mrs. Williams," Stephanie said finally, "I'll finish the translation by Thursday morning, and I'll include detailed technical analysis that will help you understand not just what Beijing International Ventures is proposing, but how to counter-negotiate for better terms based on the actual value of what they're asking for." Sarah nodded, feeling something that might have been relief or terror, because she was starting to understand that this conversation was going to change everything about how Teknova operated. And she wasn't sure whether she was ready for the kind of transformation that acknowledging Stephanie's capabilities would demand. "But," Stephanie continued, "I want you to understand something before we go any further. This isn't just about me getting recognition for my qualifications, or you solving your immediate crisis with the Chinese investors. This is about you deciding whether you're ready to confront how many other qualified people you've overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated because they didn't fit your assumptions about what expertise looks like." The question was a challenge that went far beyond the immediate crisis, because it forced Sarah to consider whether she was ready to examine not just her hiring practices, but the fundamental beliefs about merit, qualification, and value that had guided every decision she had made as a CEO. Sarah looked around the conference room, taking in the evidence of Stephanie's capabilities that had been hidden in plain sight for 3 years, and realized that solving the Beijing International Ventures crisis might be the easy part of what she was facing, because the harder challenge would be rebuilding Teknova into the kind of company that could actually recognize and utilize the talent that was already there, waiting to be seen. "Stephanie," Sarah said, "I want you to know that regardless of how this week ends, You've already changed how I'm going to run this company. And I want you to help me figure out how many other people I've been too blind to see." But even as she said the words, Sarah could feel the weight of Thursday's deadline pressing down on both of them, because they had less than 60 hours to translate 847 pages of technical documentation, prepare for a meeting that could transform Technova's future, and somehow navigate the personal and professional transformation that was already reshaping everything Sarah thought she knew about: building successful companies. The clock on the conference room wall showed 11:17 p.m., and Sarah realized that she was about to spend the next 3 days discovering whether the most important business deal of her career would be saved by the person she had spent 3 years treating as invisible, and whether she was ready to become the kind of leader who deserved the loyalty and expertise that Estefany was offering. As she watched Estefany return to her work, translating complex technical specifications with the kind of focused precision that Sarah recognized from her own most challenging projects, she realized that the next 60 hours would determine not just whether Technova survived, but whether Sarah Williams was capable of evolving into the kind of CEO who could build the company that both she and Estefany deserved to be part of. But what happened next? As Estefany began revealing the true scope of her capabilities and the depth of knowledge she had been hiding for 3 years, would challenge everything Sarah thought she knew about intelligence, qualification, and the invisible systems that determine who gets the opportunity to shape the future of technology. The next morning arrived with the kind of California sunshine that makes impossible dreams feel achievable. But Sarah Williams woke up at 4:30 a.m. with the distinct feeling that she had fallen asleep in one reality and awakened in a completely different one. Because yesterday evening, she had been a desperate CEO facing the collapse of her biggest deal. And now she was a desperate CEO whose salvation might come from the woman she had been unconsciously dismissing for 3 years. Sarah arrived at Technova at 5:45 a.m. to find that Estefany had never left the building. And when she walked into conference room C, she discovered that the overnight transformation was even more dramatic than she had imagined, because the small meeting space now looked like the command center for an operation that was simultaneously translating advanced AI protocols, analyzing competitive market strategies, and designing technical solutions that Sarah's official development team had been struggling with for months. Estefany looked up from her work with the kind of alert focus that Sarah recognized from her own all-night coding sessions during the early days of building Technova. Except there was something different in Estefany's expression, a confidence that hadn't been there the night before, as if removing the pretense of invisibility had also removed some internal limitation that had been constraining her capabilities. "Good morning, Mrs. Williams," Estefany said, and Sarah noticed that her accent seemed even less prominent now, as if authenticity was somehow improving her English pronunciation. "I have the first 200 pages translated and analyzed, with cross-references to current industry standards and competitive analysis based on what Beijing International Ventures is actually requesting versus what they're publicly claiming to want." Sarah poured herself coffee from the machine that someone had brought to the conference room sometime during the night, and looked at the whiteboards that were now covered with diagrams, flowcharts, and technical specifications that demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that Sarah associated with the kind of consultants who charged $500 per hour and still couldn't guarantee results. "Estefany," Sarah said, settling into a chair across from someone who was no longer her cleaning lady, but wasn't yet officially anything else. "I need you to help me understand something. Yesterday you were translating documents that were completely incomprehensible to me. Today, you're providing strategic analysis that looks more sophisticated than anything my business development team has produced. What am I missing about what Beijing International Ventures is really trying to accomplish?" "They're not trying to invest in Technova," Estefany said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years analyzing these kinds of international business strategies. "They're trying to acquire the bridge technology that will allow Chinese AI systems to integrate seamlessly with Western markets. And they're willing to pay $15 million for exclusive access to your neural network protocols, because those protocols are the missing piece in their plan to dominate global AI commerce." Sarah felt her coffee cup slip slightly in her hands, because she was starting to understand that the deal she had been desperately trying to close might actually be the deal that would hand over Technova's most valuable intellectual property to competitors who were planning to use it to control markets that Sarah had been hoping to expand into. "But that means," Sarah said, her voice trailing off as the implications began cascading through her mind, "that means they're not partners, they're predators. And I've been so focused on closing this deal that I haven't been analyzing whether it's actually good for Technova's long-term interests." Stephanie nodded, and Sarah could see something in her expression that looked remarkably like sympathy mixed with the kind of professional respect that comes from watching someone finally grasp the strategic complexity of a situation they had been oversimplifying. The documentation makes it clear that Beijing International Ventures has similar agreements with at least 6 other American AI companies, and they're planning to integrate all of these technologies into a comprehensive platform that will give them competitive advantages in markets where individual American companies are currently competing against each other, as Stephanie explained, pointing to sections of translated text that revealed the scope of what Sarah now realized was not an investment opportunity, but a carefully orchestrated acquisition strategy. Sarah stood up and began pacing the small conference room, her mind racing through the implications of what she was learning, because if Stephanie's analysis was accurate, then accepting Beijing International Ventures' offer would not save Technova. It would eliminate Technova as an independent competitor and transform the company into a subsidiary that existed primarily to support Chinese market dominance in AI technology. "So what are our options?" Sarah asked, turning to face someone who 12 hours ago had been invisible to her, and who now might be the only person who could help her navigate the most complex business decision of her career. Stephanie's answer revealed yet another layer of capabilities that Sarah hadn't suspected. "We counteroffer. Instead of selling them exclusive access to our neural network protocols, we propose a joint venture that gives us access to Chinese markets while maintaining Technova's independence and intellectual property rights. But to make that work, we need to demonstrate that we understand their technology as well as they understand ours." "Stephanie," Sarah said, "what you're describing sounds like the kind of international business strategy that requires years of experience in Chinese corporate culture, detailed knowledge of their regulatory environment, and relationships with decision makers who can actually authorize the kind of partnership you're talking about. How do you know enough about Beijing International Ventures' internal operations to even suggest this kind of counter-proposal?" Stephanie walked to her bag and pulled out what looked like a thick portfolio, and when she opened it, Sarah saw business cards, photographs, and documents that suggested connections to the Chinese technology industry that went far beyond academic credentials. "Mrs. Williams," Stephanie said, her voice taking on the tone of someone who was about to reveal information that would change everything. "I didn't just study at Beijing University. I worked for Beijing International Ventures for 2 years before I came to the United States. I was part of the team that developed their acquisition strategy for American AI companies." Sarah's voice was barely audible when she asked, "You worked for Beijing International Ventures? The same company that's trying to acquire our technology? And you've been cleaning offices at Technova for 3 years without mentioning that you used to work for our potential business partners?" "I left the company when I realized that their acquisition strategies were designed to eliminate American competitors rather than create genuine partnerships." Sarah felt the room spinning around her, because she was starting to understand that the crisis she had been facing with Beijing International Ventures wasn't just about translation or communication. It was about the fact that she had been preparing to negotiate with people who had been systematically acquiring American technology companies, and the person who knew their strategies better than anyone else in Silicon Valley had been pushing a mop cart through her hallways for 3 years. "Why didn't you tell me this yesterday?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with something that might have been anger or panic or recognition that she was completely out of her depth in ways she hadn't even begun to understand. Stephanie's answer was simple and devastating. "Because yesterday, you thought I was just a cleaning lady who might be able to help with translation. Today you're starting to realize that I might be the only person in this building who understands what Beijing International Ventures is actually trying to accomplish. Which version of me did you think you were ready to listen to? The question forced Sarah to confront the uncomfortable truth about how she processed information, evaluated expertise, and made decisions about whose knowledge was worth taking seriously. And she realized that even now, even with all the evidence spread across the conference room whiteboards, part of her was still struggling to reconcile Estephanie's appearance and accent with the level of strategic sophistication she was demonstrating. "Estefanie," Sarah said, trying to steady her voice, "I need you to help me understand exactly what Beijing International Ventures is planning to do with Technova's technology. And I need you to help me figure out how to protect my company without losing the opportunity to expand into Chinese markets. But first, I need to know why someone with your background and expertise ended up cleaning offices instead of running technology companies. I came to the United States in 2018 because I wanted to work for American AI companies that I thought were more innovative and less constrained by government oversight than Chinese firms." Estefanie began, her voice taking on the tone of someone who was about to explain how dreams collide with reality in ways that leave lasting damage. "I had letters of recommendation from professors at Beijing University, references from senior executives at Beijing International Ventures, and a portfolio of technical projects that demonstrated expertise in exactly the kind of AI development that American companies were desperately trying to master. I thought American companies would be excited to hire someone who understood both Chinese and American approaches to artificial intelligence. Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Tesla, and 42 startups including Technova. I received 3 interviews, and all 3 ended the same way. They said my English wasn't clear enough for technical communication. My Chinese education wasn't equivalent to American degrees, and they were concerned about potential conflicts of interest related to Chinese technology transfer regulations." Sarah felt something cold and sharp settling in her stomach, because she was starting to understand that the crisis she was facing with Beijing International Ventures might have been prevented if the American technology industry had been better at recognizing and utilizing the expertise that was already available, instead of creating barriers that forced qualified people into invisible service positions. After 6 months of applications and rejections, my visa status was running out, and I needed income to support myself while I figured out how to get American certifications that would make my Chinese qualifications acceptable to American employers, Estefanie explained. The cleaning job at Technova paid enough to cover rent and gave me access to the kind of technical discussions I had been hoping to participate in as an employee. Sarah realized that she was learning about systematic failures in her industry that had consequences far beyond individual hiring decisions, because qualified people like Estefanie were being forced into positions where their expertise was wasted, their contributions were invisible, and their knowledge was unavailable to companies that desperately needed exactly the kind of international experience and technical capabilities they possessed. "But Estefanie," Sarah said, "why didn't you try to start your own consulting company? Why didn't you leverage your connections to Beijing International Ventures to create opportunities that didn't depend on American companies recognizing your qualifications?" Estefanie's answer revealed another layer of complexity that Sarah hadn't considered. Because when you leave a major Chinese technology firm to work in the United States, Chinese companies assume you've been compromised by American interests, and American companies assume you're a potential security risk because of your Chinese connections. I was caught between 2 systems that were both suspicious of anyone who understood both perspectives. Sarah felt the weight of systemic problems settling over the conference room, because she was starting to understand that the challenges she was facing with Beijing International Ventures were symptoms of larger failures in how the technology industry managed international talent, cross-cultural expertise, and the kind of strategic thinking that required understanding multiple economic and political systems simultaneously. But there wasn't time for philosophical reflection on industry-wide problems, because the clock on the conference room wall showed 7:23 a.m. on Wednesday morning, and Sarah had exactly 54 hours and 37 minutes to prepare for a meeting that would determine not just Technova's future, but her own career trajectory, and Estefanie's opportunity to finally utilize capabilities that had been hidden and wasted for 3 years. "Estefanie," Sarah said, her voice gaining the kind of determined focus she used when facing technical challenges that seemed impossible until they were solved. If you help me transform this crisis into an opportunity, if you help me understand how to negotiate with Beijing International Ventures from a position of strength instead of desperation, and if you help me rebuild Technova into the kind of company that can actually recognize and utilize international expertise, then we're going to be partners in whatever comes next. The offer was more comprehensive than anything Sarah had ever proposed to a potential employee, because it involved not just hiring someone with impressive qualifications, but fundamentally changing how Technova operated, how it evaluated talent, and how it approached the kind of international business relationships that were becoming essential for survival in a global technology market. Stephanie looked at Sarah for a long moment, and Sarah could see her evaluating not just the professional opportunity, but the personal risk of trusting someone who had spent 3 years demonstrating an inability to see past surface appearances to recognize actual capabilities. "Mrs. Williams," Stephanie said, "I'll help you prepare for the meeting with Beijing International Ventures, and I'll help you understand how to counter-negotiate for better terms. But I want you to understand what that's going to require from both of us. Second, you're going to have to be willing to acknowledge publicly that Technova's most important business breakthrough came from someone you had been treating as invisible. And third, you're going to have to decide whether you're ready to rebuild this company's culture in ways that will prevent other qualified people from being overlooked the way I was." The requirements were more comprehensive than Sarah had expected, because they involved not just solving her immediate crisis, but committing to the kind of fundamental changes that would affect every aspect of how Technova operated, hired, and evaluated contributions from people whose backgrounds didn't fit traditional Silicon Valley patterns. "Stephanie," Sarah said, "if you can help me save this deal and transform it into something that strengthens Technova instead of compromising our independence, then I'm ready to do whatever it takes to become the kind of CEO who deserves to work with someone with your capabilities." But even as Sarah made the commitment, she could feel the weight of everything she didn't yet understand about international business negotiations, Chinese corporate culture, and the technical complexities of AI development that would determine whether her good intentions could be translated into successful outcomes. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of translation work, strategic analysis, and technical preparation that transformed Conference Room C into a war room where two women from completely different backgrounds worked together to solve problems that neither of them could have addressed alone. And by Thursday morning, Sarah Williams had learned more about her own industry, her own company, and her own limitations than she had learned in the previous 3 years of running Technova. Thursday morning arrived with a kind of fog that makes San Francisco feel like a city floating between realities. And Sarah walked into Conference Room C to find that Stephanie had completed not just the translation of all 847 pages of technical documentation, but had also prepared a comprehensive counter-proposal that demonstrated strategic thinking sophisticated enough to impress international business negotiators who were accustomed to dealing with the most successful technology companies in the world. "The translation is complete," Stephanie said, gesturing toward neatly organized stacks of documents that represented 48 hours of work that would have taken Sarah's entire team weeks to accomplish. "But more importantly, I've identified 17 specific areas where Beijing International Ventures' proposal can be modified to create genuine partnership opportunities instead of acquisition disguised as investment." Sarah looked at the evidence of Stephanie's work, spread across tables and whiteboards like a masterclass in international business strategy, and realized that she was looking at the kind of comprehensive preparation that could transform tomorrow's meeting from a desperate attempt to save a failing deal into a confident negotiation between equals who both had valuable assets to offer. "Show me," Sarah said, settling into a chair across from someone who had evolved from cleaning lady to translator, to strategic advisor to potential business partner in less than 72 hours. What Stephanie revealed over the next 4 hours was a complete reimagining of Technova's relationship with Beijing International Ventures. Because instead of selling exclusive access to American AI protocols, Stephanie had designed a framework for joint development that would give Technova access to Chinese markets while maintaining intellectual property rights and competitive independence. The key insight, as Stephanie explained, pointing to diagrams that mapped out complex international business relationships, is that Beijing International Ventures needs Technova's neural network protocols not because they want to eliminate us as competitors, but because they want to integrate our approaches with Chinese AI development in ways that create hybrid systems more powerful than either approach alone. Sarah felt her understanding of the entire situation shifting because she was starting to see that what she had interpreted as a predatory acquisition attempt might actually be an opportunity for collaboration that could benefit both companies if negotiated properly. So instead of selling them our technology, Sarah said, working through the implications of what Stephanie was proposing, we licensed specific protocols while gaining access to Chinese AI approaches that could improve our own systems. Stephanie nodded, and Sarah could see the excitement of someone who was finally able to contribute technical and strategic expertise that had been developed over years of international experience, but had never been utilized in a professional context where it could make a meaningful difference. Exactly. And because I understand both their technical capabilities and their strategic objectives, I can help you negotiate from a position of informed strength instead of desperate hope, Stephanie said. But that means you're going to have to walk into tomorrow's meeting with Liu Wei prepared to demonstrate that Technova understands Chinese AI development better than they expect, and that requires trusting my analysis of their technical capabilities. The challenge was more complex than Sarah had initially realized, because succeeding in tomorrow's meeting would require not just translating documents or understanding business strategies, but demonstrating cultural competence and technical expertise that could only come from someone who had worked directly with Chinese technology companies and understood their approaches to innovation and partnership. Stephanie, Sarah said, I need you to be in that meeting with Liu Wei tomorrow. Not as a translator, not as a consultant, but as Technova's Chief Technology Officer, presenting technical analysis and strategic recommendations that demonstrate our understanding of both American and Chinese approaches to AI development. The proposal was more radical than anything Sarah had ever suggested, because it involved not just hiring someone with unconventional qualifications, but putting her in a position of visible authority during the most important business meeting of Technova's history. Stephanie was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see her calculating the personal and professional risks of accepting such a dramatic change in status and responsibility, especially given the cultural and linguistic barriers she would face in convincing Chinese business executives that an American technology company had the international expertise to be a genuine partner rather than just another acquisition target. Mrs. Williams, Stephanie said finally, if I walk into that meeting as Chief Technology Officer of Technova, Liu Wei and his team are going to recognize me immediately because they know my work from Beijing International Ventures, and they're going to realize that you've just hired someone who understands their strategies better than most of their own employees. Sarah felt a surge of excitement mixed with terror because she was starting to understand that tomorrow's meeting might involve revelations and strategic maneuvering that went far beyond anything she had experienced in her career as a Silicon Valley CEO. Is that good or bad for our negotiating position? Sarah asked, already sensing that the answer would determine whether Technova emerged from tomorrow's meeting as an independent success story or a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating complex international business relationships. Stephanie's smile was the first genuinely confident expression Sarah had seen from her since this entire crisis began. Mrs. Williams, it's going to be spectacular. Stephanie was wearing a perfectly tailored business suit that Sarah had never seen before. Her hair was styled in the kind of elegant professionalism that suggested years of experience in high-stakes corporate environments. And when she spoke, her accent had somehow become an asset that demonstrated international sophistication rather than a barrier to communication. Are you ready for this? Sarah asked, feeling nervous in ways that had nothing to do with technical preparation and everything to do with the realization that she was about to discover whether the most important business decision of her career had been brilliant or catastrophically naive. Mrs. Williams, Stephanie said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who was finally operating in an environment where her qualifications were not just recognized, but essential. "I've been ready for this meeting for 3 years." At exactly 2 p.m., Liu Wei arrived at Technova with an entourage that included 2 technical specialists, a business development executive, and a translator who clearly expected to be essential for communication with American executives who wouldn't understand the cultural nuances of Chinese business practices. Sarah watched Liu Wei's expression change the moment Stephanie walked into the conference room, because his face shifted from polite business formality to something that looked remarkably like surprise mixed with recognition and what might have been professional respect. "Stephanie Morales," Liu Wei said in perfect English, rising from his seat with the kind of formal courtesy that Sarah recognized from international business protocols she had studied, but never experienced firsthand. "I was not expecting to find Beijing University's former star student working for Technova." When they switched back to English, Liu Wei was looking at Sarah with a completely different expression, one that suggested he was no longer dealing with a desperate American CEO who needed his investment, but with someone who might have strategic advantages he hadn't anticipated. "Ms. Williams," Liu Wei said, "I must congratulate you on hiring Ms. Morales as your Chief Technology Officer. Her work on cross-cultural AI integration protocols is familiar to everyone in Beijing's technology community. This changes the nature of what we can accomplish together." Sarah felt a surge of vindication mixed with terror, because she was starting to understand that Stephanie's qualifications were not just impressive by Silicon Valley standards, but were recognized by international technology leaders as genuinely exceptional. And she realized that her decision to promote Stephanie might have just transformed Technova from a successful startup into a company with access to expertise that her competitors couldn't match. What followed was a 4-hour negotiation that demonstrated why international business relationships require cultural competence, technical sophistication, and strategic thinking that goes far beyond what Sarah had learned in business school or developed during her years of running a domestic technology company. Stephanie led discussions of technical protocols with the kind of detailed knowledge that impressed Liu Wei's technical specialists, negotiated intellectual property agreements with the cultural sensitivity that prevented misunderstandings that could have derailed the entire partnership, and presented counter-proposals that demonstrated strategic thinking, sophisticated enough to earn respect from executives who were accustomed to acquiring American companies, rather than partnering with them as equals. By 6 p.m., when Liu Wei and his team left Technova, Sarah Williams had not just saved the $15 million investment deal, she had negotiated a comprehensive partnership that would give Technova access to Chinese markets, joint development opportunities with Beijing International Ventures, and intellectual property protections that would allow the company to maintain its independence while expanding internationally. But more importantly, Sarah had discovered that the most qualified person to lead Technova's expansion into global markets had been pushing a mop cart through her hallways for 3 years, invisible and underestimated, waiting for someone to recognize that expertise comes in forms that don't always match traditional expectations about credentials, appearances, and cultural backgrounds. That evening, as Sarah and Stephanie sat in the conference room that had been transformed from a crisis management center into the birthplace of Technova's international expansion, Sarah realized that the events of the past week had changed more than just her company's business strategy. "Stephanie," Sarah said, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond not recognizing your qualifications. I owe you an apology for participating in systems that make people like you invisible, and I want you to help me rebuild Technova into the kind of company that recognizes talent regardless of where it comes from or how it's packaged. Technova has the opportunity to become a model for how American technology companies can succeed globally by recognizing and utilizing international expertise instead of overlooking it." 6 months later, Technova's partnership with Beijing International Ventures had generated $47 million in new revenue. The company had expanded into Asian markets with unprecedented success, and Stephanie Morales had been featured on the cover of TechCrunch as the CTO who's revolutionizing cross-cultural AI development. But the most important change wasn't financial or strategic. it was cultural. Because Technova had implemented hiring and evaluation practices designed to recognize talent regardless of traditional credentials. And the company had become known throughout Silicon Valley as a place where international expertise was valued, cross-cultural competence was essential, and the most qualified person for any position might be someone whose background didn't fit conventional expectations. Sarah Williams learned that building successful companies requires not just technical innovation and business strategy, but the wisdom to recognize that extraordinary capabilities often come disguised as ordinary people, and that the most important decisions leaders make are about who they choose to see, hear, and value in organizations where everyone's contributions matter. But not everyone's contributions are equally visible. The woman who had once been invisible while cleaning Sarah's office every evening had become the architect of Technova's transformation into a global technology leader, proving that genius doesn't announce itself with credentials and accents, but reveals itself through the quality of thinking, the depth of knowledge, and the commitment to excellence that transcends cultural boundaries and defies superficial judgments about who deserves the opportunity to shape the future. And every evening, when Sarah walked through Technova's expanded offices and saw the diverse team of international experts that Stephanie had helped her recruit, she remembered the most important lesson of her career: that the most qualified person in any room might be the one everyone else assumes doesn't belong there, and that true leadership means creating environments where hidden potential can be revealed, developed, and utilized to build something extraordinary together. The story of Sarah Williams and Stephanie Morales became legendary in Silicon Valley, not just because of the business success they achieved, but because it demonstrated that recognizing overlooked talent isn't just morally right. It's strategically essential for any organization that wants to thrive in a global economy, where the most innovative solutions come from combining diverse perspectives, international expertise, and the kind of cross-cultural understanding that can only be developed by people whose life experiences have taught them to see opportunities where others see only obstacles. If this story inspired you to look more carefully at the people around you, to question your assumptions about who has valuable knowledge to contribute, and to consider whether you might be overlooking extraordinary capabilities that are hiding in plain sight, then please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more stories about the hidden potential that exists in every workplace, every community, and every interaction between people whose different backgrounds and experiences can create solutions that none of them could achieve alone.